Earl is a small-time thief who wins $100,000 in a lottery ticket. But as he's celebrating, dancing in the street, he's hit by a car and the ticket blows away. Later, in his hospital bed watching late-night television, Earl learns about karma, and his life is transformed. He makes a list of everything he'd ever done wrong, and he sets out to mend all of it. After repairing the first, karma returns his lottery ticket, which then funds his subsequent efforts. That's all in the first episode. My Name is Earl is my favorite sitcom. It's a show about what true conversion looks like, about how Earl's life is redeemed by living in obedience to karma. Of course, it's predicated on a bit of a fudge. Karma is just a law of nature, that good things happen when you do good and bad things happen when you do bad. It doesn't tell you what to do, and it certainly doesn't have a personality. But for Earl, karma is a personality, and it speaks to him. The trick that the writers play is to replace language about God with karma, I guess to make it more palatable to an irreligious audience. But the substance of the show is an examination of the amazing good that follows when we allow ourselves to be guided by the impulse of goodness. I tell you about Earl because of the way I think his story relates to today's text. Blessed are the meek, Jesus says, for they shall inherit the earth. Now, meekness isn't a word that we use much today, and it's not a virtue that we value as something to be pursued, probably because it conjures in us ideas we find unattractive, like being mild or small, a bit flaccid, wet. But that's not what Jesus is promising in connecting meekness with the good life. To see what Jesus means and to see how it relates to Earl, let me put before your mind two images. In one, a wild stallion races uninhibited across a windswept ridge. In the other, a shire horse hauls a plow across a fallow field. To grasp what Jesus is trying to say requires understanding what differentiates them. What trait or quality is capable of transforming a free, instinctual, and untamed animal into something disciplined, trained, and capable of cooperating in productive work? I use the example of the horses because of the word Jesus used here, praus. It's a word taken from animal husbandry, and it's actually the same idea he uses a few chapters later when he invites those who are weary and heavy laden to take his yoke upon them. It has to do with the way an animal comes to submit its powers to another, becoming compliant and receptive, not weak, not powerless, but productive towards a purpose. Blessed are the praus, he says, by which he means those whose raw potential, those whose ability to make a difference in the world has become responsively obedient to the direction of another. Now, that idea might not appeal to you any more than the idea of smallness or mildness of temperament. In today's world, you and I prize few things as highly as independence, self-reliance, and self-determination. The idea of subjecting yourself to another sounds regressive, like returning to a world of values from which we're all struggling to emancipate ourselves. But let me put before you two examples of meekness from Scripture who I think illustrate why meekness might be key to the life that Jesus proposes, which is the abundant life, the thriving life, a happy life. Now, whatever its historical merits, the view of humanity given to us in the creation narratives in Genesis reveal an image of the human ideal. Adam, flourishing, not because he lives according to untamed drives, but because he lives in obedience, putting his powers to constructive use as God's gardener. He meets with God in the cool of the day and then spends the rest of his life obediently caring for creation, which results in harmonious relations between humanity and the environment, between humanity and God, and between individuals. And notice here that a garden isn't a natural thing. It's an artifact of creativity and imagination. Gardening takes nature and through the application of culture makes it better. Eden was a place where both human community thrived and nature flourished in balance, which might mean that meekness might be what's needed if we're to practice the kind of stewardship of creation needed to address the environmental challenges that confront us today. I just put that before you for your reflection. Notice, too, that when Adam and Eve confront their temptation, at least part of what they're called upon to decide is whether they'll accept their status as God's creatures and whether they'll choose to live in the ways that are appropriate to it, which is in responsive obedience. It has to do with whether they'll choose meekness. Jesus, who Paul calls the second Adam, also exemplifies meekness. It couldn't be more clear. Instead of exercising transcendent omnipotence, instead of demanding our adoring worship, which was his due as equal to God, Paul tells us in 2 Philippians that Jesus chose servanthood, living in obedience to another. He says so himself, I do nothing by myself. I only do what I see my Father in heaven doing. And that's the pattern we see in his life. He gets up in the morning to pray while it's still dark. And then he goes about his day responding obediently to the promptings of the Spirit, to the stirrings of compassion, and to the requirements of neighborly love. What results is healing, is the foundation of a loving community, is the restoration of humanity's relationship with God, and the possibility that things on earth might finally be as they are in heaven. So there's a lot to be said for meekness. It's not weakness. It's not limp. It's not timid or mild. It's powerful and strong. But it's a way of exercising power that submits to the direction and the calling of pure goodness. In these reflections, we're examining the idea that what's on offer in Jesus' new kingdom, the good it promises, is achieved through a set of practices, through a pattern of life that results in what he calls makarios, which is fulfillment or flourishing, or the happiness that comes with living as you were created to live. So what practices characterize meekness? I'll name 3. First, like Adam and Eve, the question before us is whether we'll choose to live in the ways that are appropriate to our being God's creatures, whether we'll choose meekness. Do we want to live in the way that God created us to live? Or do we want to live as creatures of our own making, of gods of our own lives? And that's not the kind of decision we make once and then somehow expect our lives to be different as a result. It's actually the kind of decision we make continuously in each action, each interaction, in our outward behaviors and in our silent inner thoughts. It's a decision we have to practice, repeatedly putting ourselves and our power at God's disposal to be used as servants. Second, like Adam and Jesus, meekness is fostered and nourished by practicing regular communion with God. That's how we learn to hear God's voice. It's how we discern the moments of God's leading. It's how we learn to respond. Whether it's in silence, in prayer, in meditation, in worship, or study, or whatever. Practicing the presence of God regularly is the training ground for submitting our powers to God's steering. Third, like Jesus, and to a lesser extent like Earl, meekness is expressed in the practice of responding, of taking decisive action when we're inspired or moved. I think you know what I mean. It comes through feelings of compassion, through a pang of conscience, through careful reflection and reasoning, through loving your neighbor, or through that strong gut feeling. It tells you to ring a friend, to go back and buy that homeless guy a coffee, to hold your tongue instead of entering into contentious debate. The point is, the meek act. They practice following where they are led and doing what they're called upon to do. You and I can make a special commitment to do just that. Adam's meekness resulted in paradise. Jesus' meekness inaugurated God's inbreaking kingdom and his transformation of the whole world. Earl committed himself to repairing the wrongs that he'd done with redemptive results. The challenge to us is to decide, to commune with God, and then to act. And the promise isn't only our happiness, but the opportunity to apply ourselves in the service of God's redemption, transformation, and perfection of all things. My prayer is that we'd choose that pursuit, that we'd submit ourselves to God's reins, and that we'd see the outcome that God promises as a result. See you next time.